that one of the best memories I have is when I was lying in bed and I had just gotten the news from my former wife that we were going to have a baby. And I remember thinking through all of the things that needed to be done, the renovations to the house, how we're going to have to build a nursery and how much that would cost. And I was going through all of these different things. And then eventually she kind of nudged me and she said, "Are you going to say anything about the fact that I just told you we're having a baby?" And that's what happens when you're in a relationship with someone who has an engineer's brain. We don't necessarily go right towards the important emotional, relational stuff. We go to the logistics of all of it. But right about that same time, I was a youth pastor during that time, and I was at a church in Montgomery. And one of the goals of every youth pastor is to be able to have the opportunity to preach in big church. Because when you're a youth pastor, you all the time are talking to the students, or they might let you do a devotional somewhere. But until they let you preach in big church, you're not really kind of there yet. And so the church I was in Montgomery decided that this was my opportunity. And so they chose Father's Day to be the first Sunday that I would get to preach in big church. So that's the first time I remember working on that. Now, the interesting thing about that was the reason they picked me was that we were just about to have my first son, Josh. In fact, he was born 4 days later. From a planning standpoint now, I realized there's one of two things going on. Either they were completely overlooking the fact that the odds were high that I would not be available to preach because we had a baby that was due anytime, or the senior pastor was really hoping that he would get to preach anyway because they get kind of possessive of the pulpit, and so he scheduled me on that day assuming that I would not be able to be there to preach. Either one of those is fairly likely. But as it turned out, I got to preach. And so what I wanted to do is this Sunday came up, and as we were looking, I said, as I grabbed Father's Day, was to take an opportunity to look back at some of the things that I hoped, the things I expressed in that sermon, because that message was about what I hoped to be, the person I hoped to be as a father to this new child that was about to join my family. And I had it broken down into a couple of different categories. The first category was about me and him. He was followed shortly by a brother, so oftentimes I'll say them today because they were only 18 months apart. So for a while it was kind of like having twins. But Joshua, so it was about me and him. And then it was also about me and my job and how that might impact him. And then it was about me and my relationship with their mom. So first of all, in the category about me and them, there were several things that were on my mind because I had been doing youth ministry for some time by that point. And so I would regularly hear the students in the youth ministry talk about the struggles that they had or the things that they wished their parents or their dad was doing for them. And that drove a lot of the things where I said, I don't want to be like that, or I do want to be like that. And the first one had to do with being present. These kids talked a lot about their dads just not really being around. Their dads were caught up in work issues, those kind of things, and the dad just wasn't there a whole lot. So I thought, you know what, I want to make that a priority. I want to make sure that I'm there for my kids. The second one was about being prayerful. Because I realized after talking with these and working with parents, not just students, that oftentimes that idea of praying together as a family was just a real hurdle for parents to overcome, to figure out how to do that, because it's just maybe unnatural. They hadn't grown up praying out loud, and so how do we teach our kids to pray and those kind of things. So I wanted to be a prayerful family. And then the other thing I wanted to do was to be patient, because I realized that a lot of times dads aren't so good with patience. And so I was going to make that a goal, and maybe it's because I realized I might have already struggled a little bit with that before the baby arrived. And so I wanted to learn how to be patient and learn to be there and to not get frustrated with my boys as time went on. The second area, as I said, was professionally. I had a real concern because I was on church staff. And I'd been involved with churches long enough to know that there's this group of kids called preacher's kids who often struggle with their faith and behavioral issues and a lot of other things. In fact, people will say, oh, he's a PK, he's a preacher's kid. And it's kind of like acknowledging, yeah, that's going to be a tough kid. They're probably going to make bad decisions. They're probably going to get in trouble, those kind of things. And I thought, I want to do whatever I can to make sure that my boys love God and love the church. And then the last area on that was parental, having a great relationship with my wife and making all that work and doing that. And I realized just, growing up as a kid is hard enough. Not having stability or having conflicts at home and those kind of things just was another challenge to overcome. And so I want to do everything I could to make sure that my children never experience that as we went forward. So here we are, 25 years later, almost to the day from when I preached that first sermon and laid out all of my hopes and expectations. So it seemed like a good time just to look back and to score myself on how well I did. So we're going to take a little bit of a look, and I'm going to let you know how well I did on my expectations versus reality. Now, I know it seems like I could probably just rattle off a report card, but that wouldn't be any fun. It's the stories on why I got to see that make things more interesting, right? On the personal and being present, I actually did pretty well with that for a long time. I worked really, really hard to be there for my kids, but I hit this point when both of them were about 8 and 10 years old, starting in elementary school, to where that was the same time that I really had opportunities to work in my career and have some advancement, and did school and did some other things like that. And my former wife was complaining about my absence and those kind of things, but it was very easy for me to justify why I wasn't home. I was trying to provide a good home, was trying to provide an income and all those things, and so it was very easy. But the truth of it is, I was getting a lot more affirmation for hard work at work than I was when I got home. When I got home, I got fussed at for having been at work, right? So you give me a choice on where I'm going to naturally gravitate to. It ended up that I spent a lot more time at work than I did at home. But I rationalized it, and an odd thing kind of made me aware of that. We went to a movie one night, and it was an Adam Sandler movie. And I know it's odd to talk about an Adam Sandler movie in a church. If you're not familiar with Adam Sandler, you don't need to go look up and figure out who he is. A lot of his stuff is very slapstick, towards crude, kind of those type things. But anyway, God uses all kinds of things. God used an Adam Sandler movie to get my attention. The particular movie was a movie called Click. And in this movie, Adam Sandler goes to Bed Bath & Beyond and ends up in the Beyond section of the store, where he meets this kind of mystical inventor who has created a remote control that doesn't control your TV, it controls your life. And he shows the features to Adam Sandler, and one of them is, if you're in a situation you don't like, you can hit the fast forward button and you just scoot right through it quickly, and then it's over. And if you're in a chaotic situation where your kids and family, there's a lot of noise and you just don't want to deal with it, you just hit the mute button and it all goes silent for you. And if you really liked a part of something, you could hit rewind and live it over and over again. And so Adam Sandler takes the remote home because he's very frustrated and stressed, just kind of at that same point of life where I was, trying to get work done, trying to deal with family, all that, and he starts using the remote control. And it is like a dream come true. And so it's just this hilarious thing of him choosing how he's going to navigate through life and all that. But the thing that he didn't realize was that it was a learning remote. Now, a learning remote means that the more you use it, the more it anticipates what you want to do. Some of you may have gotten a learning thermostat in your house recently, and you change it a few times, and eventually it figures out that when you're home, it wants to do things, so it thinks for you. And so eventually this remote basically just kind of takes over his life. If there's a conflict with his wife, all of a sudden it goes into fast forward. If there's a lot of noise and chaos around him, all of a sudden it mutes. And so all of these things happen over and over again. It even had picture in a picture to where somebody's talking to you, you didn't listen to them, hit picture in a picture and like a football game would come up and you could watch the game and the whole thing. So it's this great invention. But all of a sudden he realizes that he's at the end of his life and he's missed everything. He's around his kids and he realizes that he has no relationship with his kids. He realizes that his wife is gone and married to somebody else. And he realizes that all the things that were important to him, he lost because he was using this remote control. And everybody else in the movie theater was laughing and I was crying because I realized that I was doing the exact same thing. So I didn't do so well on being present until that point. And then after that, I made the decision that every morning I would get my boys up and ready for school, and that I would be the one that would take them to school. And so I had that time with them. That went all the way up into high school to where they finally insisted that they wanted to drive themselves because I cherished that time that I had with them every day. And then in the evenings, I would work on meetings and those kind of things to schedule it to where I could be home almost every night in order to tuck them into bed and spend a little bit of time with them before they went to sleep. Which actually gets into the kind of the second thing, and that was about being prayerful. And one of the things that I decided at the very beginning was that every night that I would be with them and that I would pray for them and with them and over them. And it kind of changed over the years. Initially, it was me just kind of saying a little prayer for them. And then as time went on, I would leave out a key word here or there, and they'd have to fill in the word, kind of fill in the blank. But it was the same prayer over and over again because it was about some key things I wanted them to know. And one of the things that was really interesting that I didn't anticipate, that kind of came into the last thing about patience, was that every night, and the prayer was basically this, it was, Dear Jesus, thank you so very much for bringing Joshua into my life. He is such a blessing to me, and I love him very much. And then we'd go on and be other things as well. But something interesting happened because I taught in that prayer, we did that, but there were times that I wasn't really patient with him. Or that we might have had a little bit of conflict and not really been happy with each other, and when I'd go in to pray for him at night, and he really didn't want me in the room. But I would have to kneel by his bed and say that same prayer. Dear Jesus, thank you so much for Joshua being in my life. He is such a blessing to me. And even if we were kind of with each other, that truth was still said and the other things that go along with that. And so I think I did pretty well with the prayer. And that continued even on to the point to where they were embarrassed, when I would come in and say that. And I bet both of my boys could quote the entire prayer to you at this point just because they heard it so much with that. So on some of the personal stuff, I did okay, and some of it I didn't do so great. On the professional thing, on the PKs, I actually thought I'd done pretty well. I worked very, very hard to not have my boys up just hanging around the church a lot, because I'd realized that for kids that grow up in the church, part of the challenge is the church is too familiar, right? They're just here all the time, and so there's nothing really special about the people of God or the places of God or the message of God because they hear it all the time. And they get accustomed to that, and so part of what happens as they're trying to find their own identity is they push away from all of that. So I was very intentional to not have my kids up at the church all the time for everything and not require them to attend stuff simply because I worked at the church. And as it plays out, I thought I did fairly well, but here we are looking back. I've got one boy who loves church and goes to church and one who has no interest in going to church. I've got one who I thought had a great experience, but then says, what, it wasn't about what he says to me, that it wasn't about me. It was more about the pressure that was put on him by his friends. That, hey, your dad works in a church, and their expectations on him, and they gave him a hard time. He said it was really hard. It was hard being a PK. But one of the areas that I think I did kind of fail was their grandfather wanted to give them a nice toy, one of those battery-operated Jeeps that you drive around and everything. And while I doubt any of you would be in this loop at all, but there are churches to where there's this expectation that the church staff lives just a shade above poverty. And how it comes out is when a staff member or a pastor gets a new car, gets something nice, and some church members will start stopping by saying, oh, we must be paying you too much. Yeah, and that kind of stuff, it happens a lot. Just to be really honest, it happens a lot. And there's a sense to where when you're not getting paid a lot to begin with, and people start saying you're getting paid too much, you get very self-conscious about having anything nice because you're afraid that when decisions are made about compensation, they're going to weigh in and go, they're already getting enough money, they don't need any more. Right? So all that was in my mind, and so there were a lot of times that people wanted to do nice things for us, and I said no. And so my boys went out without just because I was caught up in that. So I don't think I navigated that real well. So maybe a C overall on that one. And then kind of on the parental thing of making sure that my boys grew up in a nice, healthy, stable family. You may have caught on that I've referred to my former wife a couple of times. That's a little bit of an indication that maybe I didn't manage to pull that one off. And I didn't. And that was one of the hardest things that I ever went through. And it wasn't just because of the relationship, the marriage that I had that was ending, but it was also this fact that I had set that as a primary goal for what I would do for my boys, was raise them in a family where we were together and they had that solid relationship that they could count on as life's challenging and difficult anyway. But I didn't do it. I couldn't find a path through to make it work, unfortunately. Now, she and I have a great relationship, and we did a good job co-parenting, but it's not quite the same as having that connected relationship. Now, the reason I go into all this is not necessarily just to bring y'all into my own introspective conversation about all this, but that it taps into a deeper issue that all of us have to navigate on a regular basis. And that's that as I look back over the things I did parenting, there's a lot of areas where I'm disappointed. Disappointed in myself, disappointed in the circumstances, or I feel like I disappointed my boys. And disappointment is really one of the biggest things that we have to learn how to navigate in our lives, whether we're believers or not. Because disappointment is kind of a constant thing that pops up. And part of the reason that disappointment pops up is because God has wired us to be hopeful. The whole message of what God did through His Son Jesus Christ is to bring hope into a broken world. And so we have this innate desire to be hopeful and to be optimistic. But every now and then this gap is created between what we hope for or what we expect and what reality brings us. And we don't like the feeling that that gap presents. And so we have different ways that we try and deal with that. I had different ways that I tried to deal with that and respond to that. You know, we kind of just want to make it go away if we can. But hope is always there. You know, even as a nation, we're coming up on the 4th of July. And really, the 4th of July is about this sense of hope. It was a hope of we're starting a new nation that's going to be different, that's going to have great things about it. And there were all of these hopes that were written into the documents surrounding what this new nation would be. And in many ways, we've achieved some of those, but there's also been disappointments. And as people of faith, the major holidays that we have, Christmas was about this baby coming into the world, God sending His Son into the world to bring hope to the world, into a messed up, fallen world that needed God. And so we celebrate the hope that comes in the birth of Jesus Christ. And then Easter, the other big one that we celebrate, that is that the hope that people will respond to the grace that's offered, the redemptive message that God gives us in Jesus Christ. Not everybody does. But our hope is that they'll hear the Easter message and that they will enter into a relationship with God through Jesus Christ and experience all that God has in store for us. We're a people of hope. It's a message of hope. And I'm going to jump into another one here. I know that this came up I may get some emails on this, but that's okay. I was at a table the other night and sitting around with some people, and they were going, what is all this Juneteenth stuff? Like, why is this a holiday? And the deal is, it was a bunch of white people that just don't know the history and why that is. But my brain was already on this message of hope, and I thought, you know what that is? That's a message of hope. It's a holiday of hope. It's hope that once everyone realizes that slavery is not just wrong, but illegal, that things will change. And so Juneteenth is a celebration of hope that things will be better. We are wired for hope. But yet, we experience disappointment. And so I want to talk to you for just a few seconds about how you navigate disappointment. First and foremost, sometimes you just don't do anything. You just recognize that what you expected didn't happen, and that's okay. Because there's something within us, the psychological feeling around disappointment often feels very personal, like the world or someone is doing something to us, like we are being wronged. And so we move into a defensive position to where we try and make this situation right. And the reality is, most of the time, we don't know all the dynamics. And so if you find yourself in a situation where you're feeling wronged because you're disappointed, stop and consider that maybe there's things going on that you're not aware of. Does the possibility exist that there's some situation or some circumstances that you don't know that might be impacting the situation, and that this is a one-off, unique situation, and the best thing is just to let it go? So sometimes the best thing to do when you're disappointed is just to acknowledge, hey, I'm disappointed, and that's okay, and to move on. If you go to a restaurant and you have bad service, right now in particular, they're very short-handed, there's all kinds of things going on. So instead of getting angry and feeling like they're not taking care of you, just recognize, this is where we are, it's okay, I'm disappointed. The other thing that happens, though, and this is where most people go, is they begin to scale back their expectations. So if I'm in a relationship with you and you consistently don't meet my expectations, I'm going to lower my expectations on you. I'm going to lower them and lower them and lower them, lower them. And eventually what happens when you do that, while it makes sense and it decreases the gap and it makes you feel a little bit better because you're not as disappointed, it leads to resentment. And I need to confess that part of the reason I am no longer married is because I did not understand that concept. Because one of the most important things you can do if you're in a relationship and your expectations are not being met is to ask yourself, have I expressed my expectations? The vast majority of the time, when people are disappointed in each other, they have not clearly expressed and communicated their expectations of each other. Instead, they simply sit in a state of being disappointed with each other and eventually resenting each other for not meeting their needs, their expectations, whatever it is. A lot of relationships end that way, not just marriages. It's a lot of tension that exists in families between siblings, parents. It exists in work environments. There's all kinds of places. And there's this weird thing to where we feel like if we express our expectations, that someone may judge us and they may get rejected. And so we're willing to take that chance of not saying anything, but that almost guarantees a more difficult ending. And so whatever relationship you're in, take that step and express your expectations. I learned my lesson the hard way, and I've been able to bring that into other relationships with my boys and others, to where I say, hey, this is what I'm expecting. Is this reasonable to expect it? And sometimes the answer is no, that they can't meet that expectation. But instead of being disappointed, we have a conversation and we're able to move forward with that. And while navigating disappointment with other people is a challenge, I think the biggest one that we face that's a challenge is when we're disappointed with ourselves. When we do things like what I just did, of looking back over 25 years of parenting and going, yeah, I didn't quite nail that like I hoped I would. And feeling guilty about the things that I didn't do well. And realizing how I just totally botched certain things and stumbled through other things and then intentionally even neglected others. And just feeling that sense of being disappointed in myself. And I think that's where we move back to this message, not just of hope that God gives us, but the message of grace that God gives us. I've met so many people over the years that are great at forgiving other people and extending grace and mercy. They're just very friendly and like, oh, that's okay, don't worry about that. But when you talk to them about how they are as individuals, they are beating themselves up all of the time. It's like everyone else is worthy of God's grace and forgiveness, but they're not. And that's just completely contradictory to what God had to say. God said that you are wonderful just like the person next to you is wonderful. That you're deserving of grace and mercy just like that other person. And just as you're able to forgive other people, you need to learn how to forgive yourself and to let go of those things that you've done where you've fallen short, because Scripture is clear that all of us have sinned and fallen short of God's plan, every last one of us. And we have to learn how to accept that grace and forgiveness for ourselves and to walk in that joy and freedom so that we can even more extend that to other people as well. Because we will be disappointed in ourselves and in other people. Anytime we have expectations, that's going to happen. But God has given us the two key ingredients that we need, hope and grace, to work through those. Now, part of the reason I say this to you is because this church is about to move into a transition into a new pastor. And as that new pastor comes in, there are going to be a lot of expectations. Expectations that he will do certain things and not do certain things, that things will go back to exactly how they were, or things won't be like they were. There's all of these expectations that you carry collectively as a church. And one of the most important things that you can do is, number one, communicate those expectations to him and to the leadership of the church. To also remember that you may not understand all the dynamics that are going on when your expectations aren't met. And to take stock and figure out when it's time just to say, you know what? That's okay. I'm disappointed. Disappointment happens. I was in a conversation with a parent not too long ago who was very stressed about their child being disappointed. I don't want her to be disappointed. I don't want her to be disappointed. I said, you know what? Disappointment doesn't kill anybody. You know? You can be disappointed. In fact, disappointment handled well can lead to resilience, to where you just learn, hey, I'm going to be let down on occasion. Life's not always going to go the way you want. And as a parent, if your whole goal is for your children to never be disappointed, you're doing them a disservice. And so as we enter this new season as a church, you're going to be disappointed. It's going to happen. But don't let that turn into resentment and into difficulties in relationships with people around you, with the senior pastor. Communicate about it, work through it, but always come back to those two main ingredients that God has given us to deal with life. Number one is hope. Hope in His Son, Jesus Christ. Hope that things are going to get better. Hope that's wired into us through all kinds of situations. And number two, grace. Give yourself grace and mercy, which is best embodied in the term forgiveness. When you blow it, when somebody else blows it, when the senior pastor blows it, offer grace and mercy through forgiveness. Recognizing that we're all on this journey together. We're all occasionally going to let each other down. We're all going to let ourselves down. It's part of how we are. But we are the people of God. And God says that as we walk with Him and He lives in us, He's given us things to navigate all of the challenges that this world brings.